Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Rob, I can hear you.
We can hear you mumbling and everything.
No,
Oh.
that wasn't Rob mumbling. That was me mumbling.
Sam, this is great
Sam.
stuff right here.
Howdy, Todd.
Howdy, brother. And
Hey,
hello.
welcome, guys. We were just hearing a little bit about the Karma Cup, a big event happening in Canada, a little competition, and Sarah was just telling us how there was 100 entries, and she's giving them 2 weeks to judge.
Yes, we are. 2 weeks.
Good idea.
Hearing about so much of this in the news these days, especially in Colorado and around Denver, that they're finding pesticides, particularly in concentrate, because again, if it's on the plant and it's going to be concentrated, it'll be in concentrated form in a concentrate, and certainly like some of these products might be safe for use with food products where it's going to be washed off, but if the cannabis is never washed and if it's just concentrated, and God only knows what happens at nail temperature to some of these things like Eagle, I'm absolutely convinced is going to thermally degrade and give off cyanide. And I don't think that that's a known phenomena, and I think that these are things that we really have to concern ourselves with in the industry, because what I was asking you more was the policy on pesticide use as opposed to pesticide testing, because I guess the notion is that they've always been used. Now that we're testing for them, we're finding them. Go figure.
Well, if your grower knows and is aware of them and reject them because you can actually have the science to prove it, that's your best asset. Just to sit back and say, yeah, let's kind of hope. No, like I said, you really have to put up the money. You have to research. You have to actually, really push your laboratory to really get up to those standards, because most laboratories out there are only doing the THC testing, and the biggest problem that we have is, we're dealing in an agricultural state, so we have to deal with all kinds of situations. So it's all about making sure that that spectral analysis is available to your laboratory, and that your laboratory is actually going to go there. So, Rob,
This is absolutely a huge issue that ATN Mark, hi everybody, in California especially, but anywhere where cannabis is being overproduced. ATN Mark, do either of you have data showing different pesticide levels in samples? I'm not interested in the name of the guy who submitted the sample or what the variety was or anything else. I'd just be interested in seeing the occurrence and levels of different pesticides in samples that have been collected anywhere, any state.
I can get some of those for you, and I'll bring them next week to Ash Church so I can show you, or if you'd like, I can email you some.
Yeah, I was just drawing from the Denver Post article by Richard Baca that described the Mahatma extracts that had to be pulled off the shelves after they found out, after they were already out on the shelves, that they had unacceptable levels of, I think, 2 different pesticides. So I don't know. I mean, I know that there's a list of forbidden ones, and certainly I think you can use integrated pest management in a way that you're not actually applying these harmful chemicals to your flowers that you're going to be selling, right?
Absolutely. And basically the agricultural chemicals that are approved for integrated pest management are not harmful to the beneficials and fairly lightweight in general, but certainly not harmful to mammals. The big issue to me is that, at least in the state of California, you have no control whatsoever. You have advice from the state government to farmers, normal farmers, through farm bureaus and through farm and feed shops and places where they give you advice and they ask you what you're going to use it for, and if you're going to use it for the wrong thing, they suggest that you not do it. It's fairly informal. It's not really a police state in California about pesticides, but they come with some horse sense normally. The grow room supply shops are run like mom and pop pet stores. You know, there's nobody telling them what to do. They get illicitly packaged Avid and Floramide and all these things that, let me tell you, in the Netherlands, you can't buy these without a spray permit. You can't store them out without lock and key. These things are deadly poisonous, you know.
That said, when they tested the coffee shops here, 54% had pesticides or fungicides.
Yeah, even here in the Netherlands. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
That's my
Very much.
4%.
yeah.
That's why we reached out to UC Davis. We reached out to an agricultural university and found that these guys were already doing that testing. So that's why it was a natural step for us to actually reach out and grab them and bring them into the discussion, because they already had the spectral analysis. So if anybody is thinking about doing this, I highly recommend in your local state to reach out to your agricultural university, because they usually have a lot of that information or have access or would know who would.
Yeah.
Am I correct, Rob?
That should be it. It's a state issue rather than a federal one, as far as I understand. And what we need to be, of course, is self-policing.
Well, I want to be not too rude and say that I think it's happening everywhere cannabis is being grown commercially. I think everybody that starts investing money into equipment and time and plants and then starts seeing bugs and problems, they almost, what are they supposed to, you know, this is the problem. We don't have good policing in our own industry, and we see this happening everywhere. I don't think it's a California thing or a Colorado thing.
I only speak about California because that's where I'm from and that's where I visit the most. But you're absolutely right, and it's something we need to take care of ourselves. And the more and more we grow, it's a self-fulfilling problem. The more and more you grow, the lower and lower the price. The lower and lower the price, the less you can afford to toss a crop. Back in the good old days when it was $4,000 a pound, and you had a crop that went bad, and you're only selling it to your buddies, you pitched it in the trash. Now you dry it and you make BHO out of it after you've sprayed it because you were afraid to lose it. I
have two sides of that, though.
The average grower, you know.
But let me throw this out, just to be devil's advocate. We've had a quasi-legal market in Amsterdam for 30 years, since 84, 85, well, really going back even further, but since the mid-'80s, coffee shops have been selling out the front door in tax, and it has done nothing to clean up the industry in Holland at all when it comes to pesticide use, fungicides, and things that are bad.
But that's because they don't have a market that actually pushes and tests it. Right now, as far as I know, Berkeley is the only city in the United States that actually makes sure that you actually test everything before it hits the floor. So it can't have something like Mahatma happen where it comes back positive after the fact after it's hit the floor. So, I mean, a lot of education and a lot of work still needs to happen, even in regulated societies. But going back to what you were saying, at least they're using it. At least they're finding these things. Science is being used. We are finding these things before that wouldn't have been an issue. We have to self-police. I get to quietly return it to somebody. I don't get to publicly humiliate them through the media and say, blah did this and blah did that. You know, that's a whole other industry regulation. And I think Todd, you wish had happened in the Netherlands, so that everybody was held to a standard, so they couldn't skirt, you know, the illegalities, because they're growing in small conditions wherever they can, however they can, whenever they can. Growing medical cannabis, as I say, growing cannabis is easy. Growing medical grade cannabis is hard. Growing medical grade cannabis consistently is an art.
I don't want to make it into that big of a thing. I mean, people produce food all the time that's organic, falls under organic standards. I mean, and it can be done. I don't personally understand why cannabis, other than prohibition, costs more than tomatoes. They flower in about the same time, don't they, Rob? How long does it take for a tomato to fully form on the vine?
It's a lot easier to grow cannabis than it is to grow tomatoes.
You might be able to get a little bit more weight of tomatoes in a given area.
Yeah, you might get more tomatoes in a given area. Okay, but they get blossom end rot. They get all kinds of problems. They're really a pain in the butt to grow.
You don't get a lot per kilo for it.
Nah, but you can eat them.
I remember in Lugano when Breeder Steve had his tents and these tunnels, and he rented them from a tomato farmer who had tomatoes growing next to Steve's Sweet Tooth and all these beautiful strains. And when the guy found out what Steve was getting per kilo, he almost fell over. Like, he just couldn't even wrap his head around ever getting that much for his for his tomatoes.
Absolutely.
Good old
But
Switzerland
that
back in the
said, when commercial growers get a hold of cannabis, when it's not a gray area thing anymore, but it all settles out, you'll be surprised how inexpensive it'll be to grow kind bud. You know, it's just another agricultural product at that point.
Yep, true enough.
Christmas tree farms, $100 for a several-year-old Christmas tree. That's more work than cannabis.
Good old cannabis. We love the cannabis.
So, Rob and Sam, what are you guys puffing on right now?
I don't know, some BHO-y stuff. It's pretty. What's it supposed to be made from? Candy Kush or something?
It's Candy Kush.
Ooh, does it focus that close? Kinda not.
Yeah, we can see it.
Tiny piece. Anyway, it works. You know me and BHO, it's not my favorite thing.
So what are you smoking on, Rob?
I just actually haven't been smoking much of anything the last few weeks. I've been in Turkey. And since I got back here, it's been sort of, same old stuff. But, yeah, I was in Turkey where I don't smoke at all for the sake of
Staying alive.
caution and staying out of jail and all that kind of stuff.
Self-preservation.
Yeah.
What's going on?
We've all seen that prison movie about Turkey. It
Yeah, Midnight Express. What a classic.
That's the scariest fucking movie I've ever seen.
Scariest movie of my childhood, that movie right there.
Yeah.
When he
I
kicked the
think it
guy.
was probably the first thing I ever saw about Turkey.
That was rough.
Yeah, when I saw they'll stab you from the waist down and it's legal, I was like, I don't think I'm going to Turkey.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a wonderful place. I just did a 15-day road trip with two really nice ladies and went to lots of villages and talked to lots of old ladies about what they used to do or what their mothers used to do, in case maybe. So it was nice. Weavers, rope makers, all that stuff.
Very cool. Tracking down the history of that particular area's hemp and other textile history?
Yeah, actually, it's all about hemp, but the history there basically boils down to rope makers who were they've been making nautical ropes since the 15th century, Ottoman naval stuff, and they still made these kind of ropes up until just a few years ago, and now the whole thing's kind of come to an end. But the rope making was the last vestige of what was going on. Women haven't really woven grain sacks and rugs and things for about 40, 50 years in most places.
Was that Turkish-grown hemp?
Yes, all of it was grown right in the neighborhood. A lot of the hemp for the weavings and things was grown right in the women's gardens. They did it right close to home and close to a water source, of course. So most of it was grown even closer to home than a lot of the food.
But it's rope-a-dope. Isn't that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the same land race they're used for hemp, and also was back in the day used for hashish. That there weren't varieties for one or the other, as I might have assumed.
Right. So it wasn't like a Manchurian strain per se.
No, and it wasn't like in Nepal. I mean, no, it was more like in Nepal, where they use the same variety for rubbing hashish, but they also get seeds and make textiles out of it. It's not really strong stuff. It's not specifically selected for being really strong dope in most cases. It might have been in certain areas where they made hashish and were legendary for it. Some part of Turkey unknown today, but
Clean hash, it was probably smokable.
yeah. But basically, when they threshed out the seeds, they kept the powder, and that was what they ended up having. So,
how many of the plants like Nepal were dual use, industrial and hashish? How many regions, I should say, were dual use plants?
If If it was like that in Turkey, as I suspect, that would be the only other place besides Nepal where I know of 3 uses of drug, seed, and fiber, all 3 taken from the same standing crop. Not the same thing grown 3 different ways, but taken from the same crop. And that, for seed and fiber, of course, that's really common. But for crossing over to the drug side, that's rare. Now, I would assume that back in the day, I mean, since subsistence farmers even today waste absolutely nothing in his produce of their daily lives, that they used plants, cannabis crops, all 3 ways, if they were interested in the drug side. So, yeah, why not?
There was some THC in it.
Yeah, there was some THC in it, but the European hemp varieties we know today are abnormally low in THC because they've been bred to be that way. I mean, just, it's part of the deal. They're not very strong sativas to begin with. Who knows we'll find out maybe from the Phylos project what Turkish varieties are, if they're Afghan hybrids with something or Indian hybrids with European. Maybe they're really an indica sativa hybrid. Could be one of the only true ones.
Now I have a stupid question. It's sativas or industrial Indo-European hemp varieties that came over to North America that we find in Nebraska. The stuff
Correct.
that made the canvas for the covered wagons that went west. Is this
Correct.
stuff? It was never bred to be low THC per se, correct? Back.
No, I'm
hundreds of
talking
years
about
ago.
the modern French and Hungarian and other varieties that have had to satisfy the EU regulations of being below
No.
0.2%. Blah blah blah. Oops.
Sorry, Todd, you got muted. Your mic, Rob is reverberating through your mic very badly.
Let me turn mine off.
But go ahead, Todd.
Okay, my question is the Indo-European hemp varieties around the time of Columbus, those stuff that came over to America, 1500s, 1600s, even 1700s. There wasn't a cotton gin until 1791. So all this stuff was never bred for its cannabinoid levels. The pre-EU standards, the THC content was never a conversation in picking for sativas, as we call them. Then my dumb question is why is a lot of the feral hemp in Nebraska bunkweed?
I think, from my understanding, before Rob starts here, the Manchurian strain that was grown was a very just tall, lanky, because hemp is grown 300 to 400 seed per square meter. You're talking about a very densely grown plant as opposed to the drug varietal, which is grown given usually a little more space. For some reason, I'm not sure why genetically it went the way that it did, but most of what is out there feral is just grown so tight and so densely. As far as I know, it's a Manchurian strain originally, Rob? You need to unmute yourself, Rob.
I might be able to do it.
There we go.
He's got it.
No, I don't know about it being a Manchurian strain. There were plenty of Chinese varieties that were brought into the North American hemp gene pool, and those, in fact, back to what Todd was saying first. He's correct. What you see escaped in the Midwest is one of either 2 things. It's either European hemp that came here and was sativa, European sativa. Let's call them narrow-leafed hemp varieties. They were the basic colonial cannabis, if you will. And after that came breeding experiments, not to lower THC content, but certainly using plants that had a low drug content. And some of those came from China. And that's what really led to Kentucky hemp, for instance, which is a Chinese European hybrid.
They didn't know about THC until 1964. How could they breed THC out? It wasn't even described in the chemical literature.
They didn't
So
breed.
Raffe did it
In my
so
They did not breed out THC.
They started with gene pools in it.
They started with gene pools that lacked THC to begin with. Whether they were Chinese gene pools or they were European gene pools, they were not selected for high THC content by drug cultures.
And I could have said, instead of THC, I could have said psychoactive effect easily, because that's really what they never really took that into consideration when they were breeding varieties that they would later use for sails or for ropes or for paints and varnishes or for clothing. I was just wondering if growing it industrial meant that the stuff turned into a lower cannabinoid level naturally. I don't think that spacing like AT and inferred has anything to do with the chemical level of the flower at the end of the growth.
No, it doesn't. Napoli hemp crops are grown, hemp seed and drug crops are grown in very narrow spacing. That's so they can get the hemp stalks that they need for the textiles. They grow them farther apart, the fiber would be useless. So it's part of the growing them for all three crops. The same thing would hold in Turkey if that's the way they did it, which I think they probably did back in the day.
Proper seed crops.
Rob, were those crops self-seeded from the harvesting and making a mess, or did they actually pick a plant and then hold those seeds and then try to like replant? Was it all self-seeding? Because that's kind of why I thought that the more the tall, thin plants succeed, the more that seed gets spread back to the soil, and year after year, tall, thinner plants become the entire crop, and that would be a form of breeding.
Sure, there's various unconscious selection, if you will, even if it's maybe not the correct term, but people aren't directly being plant breeders and picking one parent. They're applying all kinds of different selective pressures to the crop as a whole, to the populations. And if it depends on what they're doing, to answer your question. If people are collecting seeds from tall, skinny plants and shaking the seeds out and collecting the powder, that's kind of selection is maybe not so important. They've batched together pretty much the entire crop, except the males, which died by that point if they haven't been taken out and used for fiber. And if they're, for instance, growing them for rope use, as I just saw, the way those farmers did it is they would go after they'd taken the hemp when it was in August, before it's really flowered much, when all the stalks have a good fiber content and they can work the whole crop as one uniform batch. They take those plants, they're pre-flowering, and around the edge of the field where plants have a few branches anyway, they leave those plants for seed. This is how Hmong growers in Southeast Asia do it. It's how the Koreans used to do it, probably how lots and lots of groups did it. They take the fiber first and they get the seeds later. But they're not people who also use the plants for drug use. That's this third factor you're throwing in there. So in that case, in the case of these rope growers, when I asked them in Turkey, they said, yeah, we go back in September and we pull out all the plants we didn't want and we leave the ones that were the biggest and the greenest, they said. So those are the ones that are yielding the most seed and the ones that are still vigorous late in the year and maybe even later maturing than ones that have started to pass away. So, yeah, it depends on what they're growing it for, which selective pressures would be important.
That's kind of what I thought. I know of so many harvesting practices where the knife you use happens to create a certain vibration that spreads the seeds in a good pattern so that they're reseeding their crop as they're harvesting it. So I'm thinking of all the different uses that could go into naturally driving the plant in one direction or another. Like you said, if everyone's harvesting early, there are no seeds to self-hit the ground after harvest. So it would make a big difference what they're using to pretty much perpetuate on their crop than someone who's harvesting and shaking the plant and always losing a % to the soil.
Well, and don't they want to harvest the seed for the seed oil? I mean, I would only assume that you're going to, want to grab as much of that seed oil as you possibly can, and the seed protein. I mean, the seed is really the golden nugget in the crop, isn't it?
Yeah, even if they're only going to re-sow seeds, it's still an outcome that they need. You know, that the seeds are precious. That the concept that they go back on the ground and there's volunteers that come up unselected by the farmer, that's probably not likely. They rotation planted hemp, at least in Turkey, and they did most places too. It's a great soil conditioner, so they move it around in their
just
commercial field.
a much more economic source of protein than is soybean. And if you look at the life cycle analysis between soybean and hemp, hemp seed wins hands down. And so it's just a matter of time before that really makes its way into processed foods worldwide as the source of protein because it's cheaper than soybean and more abundant and actually more heart healthy too because it has the higher of the polyunsaturates.
Yeah, it's good food. That's not, however, really the emphasis where I just was. I never found anybody who made hemp seed oil. They did eat the seeds. They never went to waste. But they basically just parched them, usually along with barley, and ate them as a snack. But they still do. Now, tragically enough, though, they don't grow the hemp seeds very much in Turkey anymore, if at all. They have them in the markets, but they import them from, as the traders thought, they come by ship, I think from India or Pakistan.
India, that's right. India basically is the market corner. And it goes mostly, I've found very surprisingly, into animal feed. Again, it's a very cheap source of protein that they can use to supplement alfalfa and oats that are basically fed to animals for animal husbandry.
Do you know where they grow these seed crops in India? I was wondering that when they were telling me this.
I think it's mostly in a moderate equatorial region. Sort of the Punjab region of India is sort of one of the classical agricultural areas where I'm absolutely certain that, again, there's just wild all around on the roadside, Rob, just as you're driving through the countryside, it's just growing everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah. This is pretty small seeds, most of it. It was not even as big as the local seeds, which was kind of interesting to me. It could be almost, relatively wild stuff.
That's what it implies. Usually, the bigger, the more the hand of man.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I think the varieties that they're actually intentionally farming for oil and for seed purpose, for seed flour, is a much different variety than what's growing wild.
Yeah, I would assume so. Yeah, this it's kind of sad that the cultural momentum to eat hemp seeds is still there. You can still buy them in the markets, big bags of them, but they can't grow their own conveniently, or economically or whatever. It's not illegal to grow hemp seeds or hemp in Turkey. It just takes a license. You just tell them what you're doing.
Something's got to change. I mean, this is actually a convenient point to bring up what I saw from Lion Laughlin's Twitter post this week, which is he's a hemp farmer in Colorado who's grown a crop that apparently analyzes at 0.5%, and the state is telling him that they need to dispose of this crop. It can't be used commercially because of its analyzing at 0.5 and not 0.3, which is the arbitrary cutoff. Ridiculous. Absolutely fucking ridiculous to have to throw away an entire crop. Now, again, the margin of error in making an HPLC measurement is, depends on how the sample is handled and how it's dried. And obviously, anybody who's ever done any testing on a plant will tell you that the top will analyze very different than the bottom of the plant. So these state testers are basically going after the tops of the plant that have the highest resin content, and okay, they're finding slightly out of spec higher THCA content than allows. So now the crop is officially deemed marijuana and not hemp anymore, and
that's always been my frustration with them relying on the French EU seed with that arbitrary number, because it is exactly that arbitrary. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I mean, we found when we actually started doing experiments with hemp, we found even high-grade cannabis can make some really nice hemp.
Yeah, it depends on when you're trying to make hemp, it depends on how you're growing it. It's back to that. It's
Oh,
not
of
gonna
course, no, without a doubt.
be
But
THC content, but it is going to make tall, skinny stems if that's what you want to do.
Skunk number one had a higher fiber content than many industrial hemp varieties
Yeah.
when tested by Dr. Bocha.
yeah, yes, exactly. I was about to say, Dr. Bocha's.
It just seems so arbitrary, and again, you could certainly take many different samples and still not have an accurate statistical representation of the actual THC content of the entire crop. I mean, if the notion is that the tops are out of spec, well, what if he just whacks off the tops and just uses the bottom for fiber, or uses, you know?
Yeah, here in Europe, that's exactly what they have to do. It's batch testing, and they have to take parts of all their samples from different parts of the plant. They're not approaching it by taking a flower sample like it was drugs and looking for the stoniest part. That's not the way it's done here. They've adopted the 0.3 EU standard, former EU standard. It's now 0.2, but they didn't seem to have adopted the sampling protocol to back it up. So maybe that's how this should be challenged by whoever's got this crop.
Yeah, well, and then again, what's the measurement system that they're using? They're using the HPLC method as described in the AHP monograph for cannabis. Is that
the analysis protocol is also in the EU regulations if they want to look it up. It's in there. I don't know what it's GC, I'm pretty sure, but it's in there. They tell you the whole thing.
What variety of hemp did they grow? That was 0.5.
I don't know exactly. I could actually look into it. I was actually texting with Ryan earlier today. I could actually send him a text and ask.
Yeah, because some varieties traditionally have problems and other varieties never have problems.
Yeah.
So
well,
Exactly.
was it grown seeded or was it grown sinsemilla?
I don't know. I don't really want to comment because first of all, it's not my product. I could make inquiries into it. But
if it was grown simsimia, that alone could have knocked it up.
Right. I was thinking too that also the extraction method that they're using to analyze the sample can also affect the results. I mean, if you think about it, you're talking about 0.2% difference between 0.5 and 0.3%. I mean, you could mishandle a sample and knock it out of spec. You know,
Well,
did they run that 5 times? Were the 5 replicates all within the statistical margin of error? I mean, all of this data has to be, you can't just say that that crop has got 5.5% burn the crop. That's bullshit. Because again, even if you just look at moisture and how that sample is handled in terms of how it's analyzed, is it the dried crop at 0.3%? And is it THC-A or is it THC? I mean, these are all going to make a difference. So I'm gonna look into this and.
Well, if they're smart, he'll have the analysis done by GC because they're always a little bit lower than an HPLC.
Yeah, the problem with GC is that GC you're sending it through a thermal injection port at 200 degrees, and that changes everything, man. So
it doesn't raise the THC; it lowers the THC. That's his problem.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
We just never fucked around. We stuck with the Zolotinotia. That shit was like 0.01%, and every time the lab tested it, they were just like, I guess it's industrial hemp. Our whole country, basically, our whole hemp law was because of that strain.
My thing is this, though, is if we're not, well, ironically, now we are actually harvesting cannabinoids from hemp because of the CBD craze, call it what you will. But I always found it a little odd that we were having a cannabinoid conversation when we were really harvesting seeds and fibers and cellulose. And I think now maybe with legalization in Colorado, Oregon, now can we grow hemp varieties that are not cannabinoid limited, but maybe the best expressions that could grow in that area? That's really my question. And as we lose Rob, of course.
Well, absolutely. I just wanted to mention something I think that Chris put as a message here, which is that I've heard from hemp farmers in Colorado that time of day, when those are harvested, absolutely looking at the profile of the plant during the end of flowering is absolutely essential to meet that 0.3 cutoff on high CBD strains. Absolutely essential.
Hey, there's Mickey Mouse making his first appearance on Hash Church.
Isn't that fuck Mickey?
Mickey Mouse is an old head. Yeah, that's fuck Mickey.
There we go.
Hey, welcome Tony, and I guess welcome Brendan Dabbs, who came and left faster than we could say hello, and of course, welcome to Chris Bennett, who came in while Rob was chatting away.
Hey, Rob, how you doing?
Nice. Pretty good.
Hey, so Rob, when do you think the first evidence of cannabis grown for psychoactive purposes is, based on current archaeological data and stuff like that?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's still, I don't know. It's sort of back to that same 2,500, 2,200 year ago sort of window. The
27 maybe?
stuff all moving around in Central Asia, maybe a bit earlier. The Eastern Europe, oh boy, it's just all that stuff comes up about that same time.
Well, what about in China? It seemed like, from a lot of stuff I've read, the Chinese distinguished between their initial hemp crop that they were growing for fiber and seed and whatnot, and then that of the later, like Scythian hemp, they would call it, or fire hemp, or what the Gushis were using, likely. Do you think that came in and there were two different strains there? A drug content plant that came in maybe via Indo-Europeans, and then there was already an indigenous Chinese industrial thing, because most of even the Chinese psychoactive purposes, from what we can see in the literature, seems to start around that same time, unless we put that date of 2700 BC on Shen Nung, which is pretty debatable.
Yeah, well, that's allegorical sort of stuff, but yeah, it's around that same time. And later in history, Chinese historians refer to Western cannabis, Qima. So it was probably introduced at some point. This is later on in time that they're talking about this, but yeah, there was a Western influence, which in their case would have meant that it was introduced at a later time when they already knew about Dama, the other hemp. So yeah.
So what about, have you heard anything about this recent Scythian thing with the gold bowls and cups that were mistakenly reported as bongs in the press, but were actually preparations for drinking cannabis?
Yes. Well, they were nice bowls, and if we're to follow where they came from and your dating and things, the assumption would be that they were from some libation, possibly cannabis. Yes.
Yeah.
I wish they were decorated somehow that was more indicative of that, but that's what I say about most things that hint at what we're after, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's always hard to go by some sort of symbolic drawing or something like that. You want something a little more solid for sure.
Yeah, very true.
Welcome Tony and Brendan Dablicious, who just came into the room. We're just chatting it up. Old school. Chris and Rob talking history. Soon we're going to be talking terms.
By this I meant whether the Scythian was coming from someplace else.
Yeah.
The Scythian genetics.
Yeah, well, we'd have to get the genetics to them, but yes.
The green crack god. Yes.
I have a question for Rob and Sam. Rob and Sam, if you were left with one genetic, only one genetic, what genetic would you choose?
Hey, Donald was going to answer.
Sorry to catch you eating, Rob.
Oh, Rob's muted too. Let me unmute Rob so we can hear him chewing.
Myself, I'm a big boy. See that? That was incredible. I actually did that by myself. Somebody loaned me a cell phone last week. That was really a scream. Now, where are you gonna grow this, Aiken?
It's you, Rob. It's you, Rob, and you, Sam. If you had your choice wherever you are in the world, and you grew one strain, and you were left with one strain, what strain would you choose?
If I could grow it outdoors, haze.
Yeah,
When
haze.
you grow it, you have one strain, indoor, outdoor,
Haze grown outdoors.
Yep. Respect.
That'd be it.
Same with me.
You know, I gotta say that I'm damn near in the same boat with you guys. Haze outdoors, nice long flowering.
However, I really think that a universe where I could only grow one variety would be
boring.
an absolutely horrible place. Let's hope that never happens.
Hey, we get
No more
philosophical. That's
fucking
it.
haze, man. I'm so tired of it after 83 years.
I'm so tired of hazing.
Could you imagine how perfect that the resin and all of the products made from the resin would be? Like if everyone was working on one strain, one resin, and there was a Legends of Hash, and everyone was like, well, I've got the outdoor haze. Oh yeah, you too. I've got some outdoor haze. Yeah, we've all got the same strain. Well, let me see your resin. And then it would really be competitive to get that resin nailed down. But at the end of the day, it would all just still be the same cereal, the same resin.
I'd immediately start working on it until I could get resin at least the size of grapes.
Yeah.
Why haven't you been working on that?
I have. It just hasn't gotten very far yet.
It's exponential. They'll grow the most right in the last few stages.
What I'd like to see is somebody really working on me. It'd be a good choice with a close friend here, but working on really making hashish varieties, things that aren't necessarily anything like the bud in a bag sort of model that people have been breeding to for the last 20 years more. So yeah, just different. Try to breed some different things.
Narrow leaf.
Think outside the box a bit.
Would you guys consider hash strains to be strains that either produce a certain resin head size consistently, like good for hash, like this makes a ton of 70U, or would a hash strain be about robust, complex terpenes in the experience, rather than gearing it towards yields for hash?
Well, there's two. Are you talking about today or in the future, or are you talking about traditionally? Because traditionally, hash strains were strains that were made into hashish.
Well, I see people say, like, this is the hash plant, and I'm like, I'm not going to get a shit ton of dry sif off of this, but it might be the best hash I've ever had in my life based on the way it looks, the way it smells. That's kind of why I'm like, well, look, there's two sides of hash. One is, like, we could just go around smelling the jars of dry sift, and that would be an experience of itself with never smoking it. That's kind of why I'm like, look, I have a lot of strains that I love, and I think this might make great hash. But in the end, it might just produce a shit ton of 45U, and that's not good for hash.
You know, for instance, of that is the beloved haze. It has great resin, little tiny glands, but lots of it. Kicks your ass, has a great terpene profile, whatever it takes. But it is miserable as far as getting any kind of a resin yield from it. It's really disappointing. Dry sifting, anything you do with it just doesn't work. Maybe you can rub resin from it and get it to work.
Or hybrids.
But there's a lot of breeding to do. If you really just, of course, want varieties that have the right terpene profile and give you whatever effect you want, and also produce lots of resin that's easy to get off the plant, no matter how you're going to do it. I mean, economics in the end is going to be about yield. You know, all the rest of it's going to be icing on the cake and a little extra vig, but basically it's going to be how much you can get of clean resin per agricultural unit.
Well, that's kind of what I'm afraid of, because I think of my best yielder, and I'm like, I don't want to fucking smoke Grape Crush Hybrid just because I can get 20 grams of 70U sift out of it. I want to smoke Blueberry where I get 1.5 grams, and I just look at it and worship it. So that's kind of why I wanted your definition of what the future of hash should be.
To be honest, I don't think you have to worry, because I bet you anything we can put pretty much any terpene profile in any established resin variety. So I don't think there's a big problem.
So
I agree.
Did we freeze? That leads me. Quick question in regards to that, Sam. In regards to when did you guys come across terpenes as a modulator to the cannabinoid profile?
Well, about 2000, Rob and I obtained some pure THC, 100% pure. And what we did was we vaporized 25 milligrams.
Or THCA?
Yeah, it was THCA. But
Thank you.
We vaporized 25 milligrams each in a volcano on one of those little, they're like a little stainless steel Brillo pad, those little pads that they have. Okay, so we were blown away because, I mean, if you smoke 25 milligrams of hash or 25 milligrams of you get stoned and it's pretty good. But with this, the most describable thing about it was that it had no individuality whatsoever, like cannabis products do. It was really flat, one-dimensional, kind of boring. Rob, I think at the time, actually said, if this is all there is to cannabis, I wouldn't be a smoker.
Yeah, if this is what you got turned on to in high school or whatever, instead of the real thing, I don't think any of us would have really been interested. It's sort of like being a fan of Everclear. You know, the 180-something proof liquor you can get in Nevada. It's not even legal in the state of California. But it's ethanol, essentially. And nobody drinks it straight. I mean, you know, nobody just dilutes it with water and drinks it because they like it. It's a novelty. And THC was the same thing. It had no color at all.
So later that day, what we did was we mixed it with a little bit of 50% dry sipped skunk resin. And what that allowed was to create a material that was 75% THC, so less than 100%, but it was also terpene rich from the resin, from the dry sip. When we smoked that, the effects were twice as strong as the pure THC. And a light went in our heads because from the early 70s, both Robert and I, even before we met, had felt that terpenes might well contribute to the synergistic effects found in cannabis. I think one of the primary reasons was because haze, when it was tested for its THC level, was to be, you know, in the high end of cannabis, but when you smoked it, it was in the outer space of cannabis. I mean, it was really, really active. And I think that was because of the terpenes. I think that's how you felt.
Well, the other amazing thing in the early 70s was that people started growing cannabis. You know, they started growing sinsemilla. And that's when you really noticed what the difference was between fresh homegrown and what imported weed of whatever kind you ever got before, what that was. You know, that was a profound difference, you know, just to see something fresh, you know, the way Mother Nature gives it to you.
The essence of most of the weed that you smoked back in the 70s, a moldy, musty essence, you know, I mean, I remember my first bag of weed, 1974, it was moldy. Now that I think about it, it certainly was mold.
Well,
I think
I think most of what Robert and I got, even though it was imported, it was not moldy. Or if it was very, 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 very slightly.
Yeah, but a lot of weed, you're right in a lot of ways, though. It's
a general statement that most of commercial weed at the time, essentially, which came from Mexico, was probably fouled with mold and all kinds of different microbes.
If you look very hard, you would have found things for sure. And some of it, of course, is unsmokable, as you know.
Like
it was just plain ruined. Yeah. But
Well, I was a young kid on Dead Tour in the mid-'70s. By 1980, I was hooked up.
yeah.
Well, meanwhile, back to terpenes. So we smoked the pure THC. We realized this ain't it. We smoked THC mixed with resin 50-50, which made 75% THC by dry weight. And wow, that was very interesting. So then what we did a year or two later, we obtained all the cannabinoids. So all the top 10 cannabinoids, THC, CBD, CBG, THCV, et cetera, and we also obtained the top 10 terpenes. And then we were able to try the different cannabinoids, and we found out that a couple of interesting things, like number one, if you smoke pure CBD in a fairly large amount, a tenth of a gram, 100 milligrams, then what happens is it blocks the activity of even the strongest dry sift hash for about 8 to 12 hours. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing was that THCV is not psychoactive at all, because a lot of people at that time believed it was. Then we tried all the different terpenes with THC. So we tried 25 milligrams of THC, all double-blinded, with one terpene, as tiny amount as we could put it with it. And what we found out was that myrcene, limonene, pinene, and a few other definitely potentiated THC, and most of the others, or a lot of the others, also modulated THC to different levels. So some made you couch lock, some made you speedy, and it was like a revelation. I mean, we had suspected it, but we never really dreamed it would be that clear, because we did it with 12 different double-blinded test subjects with a 100-question survey before and after, and we all agreed on the same things. Different people preferred the couch lock or the uplifting, but they all agreed that that particular compound with THC had that effect. So, yeah, so this was all, maybe 12 years ago or 13 years ago, although we started it practically 15 years ago. And it's not, at first I was afraid to release the information because I thought people would start coming out with Skunky Sam's improve your weed spray, turn mold to gold. And they have to a certain degree, but what the better side of it is when people are extracting terpenes from the natural cannabis sources and then adding them back to the same. That's pretty benign as long as no chemicals and solvents are being left. I don't know what to say, but the truth of it is it's changed cannabis, and our understanding will continue to learn, but it's a really big step forward.
What I'd really like to see done is something much more sophisticated than we were able to do, and see science put to bear on this situation, and see what we can learn about different terpene combinations with different cannabinoids.
There's 140 of them.
Seems the most interesting avenue for me at the moment.
That's just 140 known, right? That's just what we know so far.
Yeah, and some of them are really in trace amounts, and that doesn't mean they're not important. But about 20 of them make up most of the terpenes in cannabis we smoke today. But there's a smattering of other compounds, and they could be key also. So
yeah, there could be a couple hundred terpenes. We just haven't ID'd them yet.
Yeah.
But the smaller the amounts, the less significant they are likely to be, just by odds.
There's probably also heavy selective pressures involved recently, in the way of people breeding. I mean, there's aromas people like, and there's effects they expect based on that aroma. It's this feedback loop thing that makes it all kind of hard to study in a more detailed way. It's important, and those things are somehow related, but they're not as related in the way I would have thought, in a biochemical sort of way. They're more related in what we individually make of each variety and our relationship with it. It's I know I'm sounding a bit cosmic for a scientist guy, but it's impossible to separate one from the other. I'm not even sure exactly how you would do a statistically rigorous test of the terpene and cannabinoid data. It'd be interesting for somebody to set it up. There's a lot more powerful tools now that we have had.
Well, and they are biochemically related. There's no question about it.
Of course, but that's not the only relationship, is what I'm saying.
Right.
I mean, I've always wondered if they're competing pathways. I mean, they use the same precursors, so what exactly is going on? Hard to say. But we've certainly jacked up both pathways in the modern Sinsemilla varieties. I mean, these hybrids are big producers of all of the above.
And terpene.
Yeah, it's not like there's a shortage of one thing or another. The terpenes seem to have become sort of a mishmash, and it's more now what plants don't have rather than what they have, in my mind. That's sort of what makes a variety and that's characteristic in the way it smells to me is a key terpene it has, or a couple of them, but also all the terpenes that it's lacking so that it doesn't smell like everything else. It's pretty inbred at this point.
The spaces between the notes.
How many distinctly different cannabis varieties do you guys think? If we were to liken cannabis strains to colors in a crayon box, how many crayons would be in that box, Rob or Sam?
Well, there's just a couple basic cannabinoids, and all the rest of the colors are terpenes, or the vast majority of them. So, figure it out like that. There's 140 known terpenes, but some of them are almost just like adding a shimmer rather than a real note.
Okay, then I put it like this, Rob. You wrote in the introduction of the Canna Bible there was less than a dozen plants that really ultimately shaped the whole breeding profile that the 90s and into the 21st century saw. So I guess what I'm really asking is how many different, if you will, original strains are we really passing around? I mean, it seemed like there isn't that many. When you sit there and we talk about haze or a Kush or Trainwreck or a skunk or a Calio, the list gets kind of short, is my point. And I was wondering, obviously, if you guys had actually collected what we know as modern cannabis and how wide of a selection it really is before it gets into just a lot of hybridization.
Well, it's already gotten into a lot of hybridization. It's already too late from that point of view. But there's several things that are going on that are going to allow us to learn more about these things. And one of those is the Phylos Bioscience project that Sam and I are involved with, and I've probably mentioned before. But with this project, we're able to, at this point, they've looked at 600 or 700, I don't know, maybe more by now, basically dispensary samples from six states, 1,000 of them maybe. And they've put together a model from this, okay? And I can't let you see it yet, but it comes down to nodes that seem to be key parts of varieties. It's hard to explain this. It's not a tree. It's more of a.
They're closely related, but no.
Yeah, they're some varieties are obviously more closely related to each other than they are to other ones. Okay. However, everything is interrelated. There's no little satellite that's not related to anything else. It's a giant web, and that says a lot. It says a lot about where we're at with varieties these days and how much reshuffling of the deck is how we've always referred to it as been going on. To refer back to what Todd's talking about from Jason King's first Canna Bible, the introduction I wrote is called "What's in a Name," and it came out in 2000, I believe. And so this is data that came basically from Sam's seed collection, seed catalog collection from getting everyone there was pretty much, and we also knew at that point all the major seed company people, the major like 6 companies. So it was easy enough to ask people, if you didn't say in their catalog, what land races primarily they'd use to make certain varieties, and then later on, which of those varieties they'd use to make other ones. After that point in time, everything, the business became much, much larger. And basically people changed the names to, for whatever business reasons they had. But nobody got any mileage anymore of telling people what was really in them. Okay, so that's why I published, realizing this is happening, that's why I published that around that time. This is 15 years ago. Since that time, certainly new things have been brought in that people had that were not released to anybody back in the year 2000. This is something that's come up much more recently also. So there are new land races occasionally that people have added in, certainly in the last 15 years. Yeah, and all this, basically people operate on clones, so people still pop new beans and get new materials, and seed industry goes on. But all that stuff basically is highly interrelated. Now, when we get to analyzing land races in the Phylos project, then we'll have this cloud, which would be like the canopy of a tree, if you want to go back to a more standard model of lineages and as a family tree. So the land races are the predecessors of everything we have today. Okay, they didn't come from outer space, they came from farmers somewhere, and not that long ago. And we've been able to collect old dead seeds and leaves from people who still have land races and things like this, and we're going to be able to get a lot of the branches of the tree, the smaller branches near this canopy of modern day varieties. Where it goes from here evolutionarily is a really good question. This is not a good position to be in necessarily for a crop plant. When it happened to corn, there were blights that nearly wiped out maize. I mean, you know, so there you have it. That's what you can learn. We can learn more from the Phylos project if anybody wants to contribute to it. I'm not that hard to get a hold of. So, yeah, participate. It's fun. Science is fun. Don't be afraid of it. It's fun.
I guess I'll take this opportunity. I want to ask Todd and Rob a combination question, because I think it goes back to something like Mark saying, like, all I got was bunky, moldy weed when I was a teenager, and I remember the kind of weed I grew up on as a teenager as Jamaican import compared to Mexican import. Now, when you said, like, we'd only grow hazes, is it because a multitude of factors, like where you're in the tropics, these terpenes preserve well? I swear that certain strains, because of the terpenes they produce, they reject mold, and they're more, basically, they are the best strains for shipping and transport. Like, Todd, you've been in all different types of situations, but there's like a day where you don't want to transport the stinky, stinky skunk, but were there ever strains that you knew you could stuff in a bag and it would never go bad, and there were certain genetics that those terps made that strain good for?
Well, I'll answer first because I have less experience than Rob. You know, I think that handling and learning how to handle your cannabis is key to what happens to it if it gets moldy. When you know, fortunately for me, I started growing cannabis when I was only 13, and I had to dry it in order to smoke it. So I inherently learned how to kind of dry it and cure it. I mean, anything from toaster ovens to what eventually ended up just being patient and waiting weeks for it to cool off and get right. But once it was right, it's still a vegetable product. And if you put it in a baggie or you put it somewhere and you're not conscious of its humidity, you can cause it to mold up pretty easily. So handling it, to me, is what you're talking about, Horatio. And there's no strains because it depends on the variety at the time of its moisture. And you know what I mean? Like, all of these factors are working into the conversation, you know. But are there mold-resistant varieties, Rob? Rob is muted. Can we unmute Rob?
So, oh, I'm muted still. Okay, try this again.
Can hear you now, Rob.
Okay, very good. Okay, there are certainly susceptible varieties. That's what we deal with today with this modern polyhybrid gene pool that we have. All the varieties we have now contain at least a smattering, or actually rather large percentage, of Afghan background. Okay, the broadleaf drug varieties. Cannabis indica, subspecies afghanica, whatever you want to call it. And these indicas, as people call them, and they are indeed one indica, are predominant in a lot of the varieties we have today. And what they brought us is an extreme susceptibility to mold. Afghanistan's a dry place. There's no reason for varieties to develop a natural resistance to mold. They just wasn't an issue. So before this time, we had varieties from Mexico and Jamaica and Colombia and Thailand, and all these were descendant from an Indian gene pool. Okay, the narrow leaf drug varieties, the true indica subspecies indica, and they came from semi-tropical and tropical areas and mountain areas, but places that had a considerable amount of rain. And for them, a natural resistance to infection by molds is a selective advantage. So we had plants that matured considerably later than the modern day hybrids, but they weren't really susceptible to mold. They were susceptible to other things, and if you treated them badly, they could get mold. I mean, but you had to treat them real badly instead of coddling them all the time and they have mold like today's varieties. So that's again the genetic background and historical background for what we see today. And yeah, it's in everything today pretty much, unless you have a variety that's pre-Afghan. So.
I guess the reason why I wonder, like, I have a bunch of plants in veg, and I created a condition in which they got infected with mold from a maple tree, and I watched as, I'm like, this is the plants with the highest, you could say, stem rub terpene production seem to be the least effective. And I know that's a genetic trait, but I'm just looking at the surface area of a plant, a mold, and the types of terpenes that would be on those micro trichomes that are available in veg. And when I look up those strains, I'm like, okay, high in limonene, and I know limonene is antifungal. Is that some of that attribute where I go over to the next strain, I'm like, this is getting destroyed, and I rub the stem, and I'm like, it smells like nothing. I'm not saying it's a universal quality, but when I found the weed that smelled the most like my dad's Jamaican compressed brickweed, it was a very peppery, spicy version of Master Kush. And it seems that that preservation and that resistance to conditions where you can press the shit out of it into a brick, stuff them in suitcases, and then send it on a boat for 3 weeks, it seems to always come back to a peppery terpene or a more sativa. Basically that same thing. I only grow sativas. I don't know much about indicas, but the tuna kush took a beating.
Yeah, I would suggest that the peppery taste that's remaining is what's left after the 3
Hold on,
weeks.
you're muted for some reason.
Huh? Am I off again?
Well, I just can't hear you.
No, I can hear you, Rob. You're not
I
muted.
can hear you, Rob.
Go ahead.
Oh shit!
So-
It was my headphones. Sorry.
It's I'm sure you'll agree, Mark. It's what was left over in your dad's Jamaica. No disrespect intended, but it was what wasn't cooked out of it in transit and in drying and everything else. It's what's left. It's the commonality of cannabis that we found in lots of imported things back in the day. And different varieties left behind different characteristic flavors, but it's what we didn't really learn about until we grew seeds from those, like you're doing, Then you see the terpenes that didn't get boiled out in transit or handling or any other processing that ever happens. So, the sesquiterpenes, some of the lower boiling point ones are what's left
Beta-caryophyllene, humulene, caryophyllene oxide. Yeah, those are the ones usually that give that peppery essence.
We smoked both of those.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I
sorry.
wouldn't suggest anybody smoke terpenes straight. It really is akin to solvent abuse. So.
You ever use terpenes to flavor your bong water?
No, but I've used what are those things called? You know, kaffir limes. So they use the leaves in Thai cooking.
Right. Okay.
There's fruits that grow on these things. I just happen to have a friend who has one in their yard, and they're really limonene rich. These things are they're just a peel basically. There's hardly anything inside. There's nothing you do with it except chop it in small pieces and fill your bong with them, like putting ice in your bong. It's a really great thing to do with old stale weed. I learned this a long time ago. This is a really good one. This is that terpene enhancement thing, primarily limonene, but there's all sweet, citrusy stuff in them, and they work great. So, yes, sort of.
Yeah, I recently did a couple dabs with my friend Dave Malone from Green Dot there in Boulder, Colorado, and he flavored the bong water with a little bit of lemongrass oil, and it was like a completely different dab. Did a dab before and then a dab after. Very, very different.
You know, it's interesting that we're talking about this because back in 2003, I opened a gallery in Vancouver called The Melting Point, and I had a vaporization station. It was actually called the Inhalation Station of Vaporization, and it was about 20+ feet long, and I had a variety of, you know, all the different top quality vaporizers that were available at the time. You know, the Aromed from Germany and the Volcano, and Riptech was there, and the Volatizer was there. There was a whole variety of these things, and because it was so early and really there was only one compassion club that existed and it was still very young, we had no real regulations or rules. It was completely not allowed, and I kind of pushed the boundaries and I just said, well, you know what, I'll let people bring their herbs and use these vaporizers and sit at the table and set it up. But I also, what I did was we acquired other essential oil secreting herbs that were medicinal, like lavender and you know, like just different things that were right next door to my store. And we had people come in and vape these different things, and eventually people started bringing in like pure essential oils. And you'd take like the tiniest little, like minute little drop of like mint, and it was the most uplifting. You couldn't even believe, like, some of these things were literally giving people the effects of being high, but in a different way from a completely different plant. And you know, damn near 12 years ago that we were doing that at the old Melting Point. Good stuff. Yeah, mint hash. Someone just said. What's that?
Aromatherapy.
Yeah, aromatherapy, you know.
What to say is listening to myself blah about any baloney. But, you know, Rob, you were one of the few researchers that got, you know, you and Dave, really, I mean, you and Rob are the few people that literally got into the whole cannabis scene. And you know, it amazes me that, you know, more of us in this don't go the way of what you've done with hemp. And, you know, what kind of caused you to get what caused you to have such a broad look at cannabis as opposed to just being into the stuff that gets us high?
Well, I guess
they were legal.
It's illegal. Yeah, it's a legal hobby. And it's one that travels well, takes you to interesting places. But it all started really, I guess, because of being involved with nature techs and going to China and seeing a hemp textile mill, and then having time off in China. And I knew a little bit about hemp things already from Hungary, you know, things made in villages for people who collected things there. But it was more like finding linens. You know, it wasn't too exciting. But still part of the picture. Then I went on vacations at first to Yunnan province in China, not where I worked at all, but where there were a lot of minority ethnic groups. And I actually saw people wearing things they said were made from hemp. And this was right about the time when some of the Hmong batik dyed, indigo batik dyed skirts and scraps from them were being used to make purses and bags and things, and they were showing up in the hemp fairs and things, and the early ones of those. So that's what piqued my interest to begin with, and I just never looked back. I started finding more and more different cultures that had used hemp for a long, long time, and in different ways, but primarily through their textiles, through their weaving. That's the thing I'm the most interested in. And
obviously your career brought you to cannabis. I mean, anyone who's picked it up is amazed with that body of work. And I'm just utterly fascinated with the history of cannabis, and no one's ever brought it together quite like you and Mark do in your latest book. And I write books, or I try to. I can't imagine ever writing a book as great as that. And I was just wondering, how long did it take you to write? How did you come up with Cannabis Evolution and Ethnobotany, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, yeah, it's no problem. It would be almost 20 years ago now, 19 years ago, that Mark and I finally met each other. Mark had written his dissertation, his master's dissertation on cannabis, and it was called Man and Marijuana, and came out in, what would that have been, 72, I guess.
New aspects of the Asian relationship.
Yes, indeed. And through that, I wrote in 1976, I came up with my way to get out of undergraduate education, and published my honors thesis, my honors dissertation, which is called The Botany and Ecology of Cannabis. And my inspiration when I went to the library was finding Mark's book. If you could do it at Santa Barbara, I could do it at Santa Cruz. And we corresponded ever since, and finally met at a Society for Economic Botany meeting. Economic Botany Society is basically a group of ethnobotanists. Economic botany is what we used to call the field before ethnobotany, really. It was the botany of plants that impinged on the economics of humans. It became a lot more than that. It became the study of humans and the plants they use in those relationships. So all sorts of plants. So through that vehicle, if you will, that investigative tool of ethnobotany, which Mark was already experienced with, he's 10 years my senior and a professor at the University of Hawaii, teaches the subject, we decided to do the book. I'd already had experience for my graduate work. I had things left from that I wanted to publish, and we set off on this grand project to write this book. We figured it'd take a few years and we'd publish it. Well, 17 years later, just a couple of years ago, this month, we finished it. And I guess if we'd known it was going to take so long, we never would have tackled it. It just seems too long at the time. But when you look back, at least. But we did it, and it just was a growing project. Probably half the 700 plus citations came to us after we got started. A lot of them in the last 10 years, last half of the project. And you just keep getting more and more information. We're trying to be comprehensive. We wanted to have a reference book published by academic press, and University of California Press has done this, and we appreciate that. And I think people feel it's a credible body of knowledge. I'd like it to have more exposure. Mark feels the same way. So I would entertain any ideas for getting this body of knowledge out to more people.
Is there a syllabus written around this book, and is this the book that will be used in colleges when, a cannabis course is offered? I think that most naturally Cannabis Evolution and Ethnobotany will most definitely be the book that is the required reading, and is this already in practice? Is this something that you're working on?
Well, I'd like to see a curriculum built. I'd like to see it a lot more simplified than all the massive information that's in cannabis. But it is a project I'm not actively working on, but I really would like to be. And it would take an educator, it would take an editor, it would take someone who knows how to pare down what's there and get the essential bits into a form that appeals to people today who want to learn, which should largely be online, I would suspect. I don't really see much of a future in trying to write books except for sentimental reasons.
Well, people are still reading, even though they're not reading per se books. I mean, we're just because they're electronically delivered information, it's still fonts, it's still words, it's still thoughts, it's still the same thing. Not to, Shakespeare is Shakespeare is Shakespeare, so to speak, and you're conveying a lot of information, and people are able to bring it in. And now more than ever, I would say, please write more, don't write less, because contributions like marijuana botany had a big impact. If it wasn't for authors like you and Mel Frank, I would have never ever cleaned out my closet and started growing cannabis if I had not found a Mel Frank grow book, and that's just my reality. And for me to stumble upon later your contribution, marijuana botany, I was amazed at that. And these were the pebbles in the river for me to step on as I walked across and learned. And I wish you guys would write more, honestly. Truthfully, I do, and even publish it, shorter papers, get right to the point. I mean, now you don't have to go through publishing houses, you don't have to wait for big books. I mean, in my opinion, people like you, like Mel Frank, you have, if you will, a literary following where we are interested in the stuff you're learning. I get to get it firsthand because fortunately you like me. but the rest of the world too would benefit from the work you do, and even if it's not these huge 350,000 word 17-year projects, but much shorter projects about the fascinating terpenes and chemistry and other elements of cannabis that are all interconnected right now that we're learning about in society, because everybody's learning right now through their smartphones, in my opinion. The news is coming in every day.
That's what I'm getting at. It's some other way to get information out there, whatever it takes.
We're doing it. I mean, because I'm hearing it, I'm like, yeah, a good 5-page article on that subject of these terpenes, or why would we pick that strain, or what every different subject we've jumped on is all a kick-ass 5-page article that you could just go in deep on, like Sam discovering the terpenes, then Sam being able to, you guys having access to the THCA. Now
Rob was with me.
Yeah, so like you guys doing that. Now let's say we're looking at me and Bubble Man and we're fucking with the same thing. What would your article be on? Like when you discover it, what would you like to see us do? Where would you like to see us go? Like I know where I'm going in, exploring the strain not being the strain by isolating the wet terpenes, the ones that disappear when they dry, and seeing if they modulate the strain in a whole different profile. But do you guys ever have things like that where you want to see, like I wanted to see, would THCA help standardize cannabis for pain, even if it wasn't exciting for everything else?
I think there's lots of interesting things people can still do. It's probably more than ever, really. There's lots of possibilities.
Marcel DeWitt at Mary Farm, I think, has a patent for using THCA for most medical applications. I believe so.
Interesting to see.
It wouldn't hold up in an infringement case, though, so you go ahead and patent it all you want. It's not worth the paper it's written on.
Thank you, Mark. You just gave me the go-ahead to keep using THCA to treat pain.
Yeah, you can't patent something that's obvious and known.
For dozens of years, what I've been doing is taking all my THCA dry sip and converting it to THC so that it was not breaking anybody's patents.
So you were decarboxylating it?
That's like that.
Everybody all over the world on that patent.
I'll dab to that.
You can't patent something that's known and obvious.
No, it's a use patent. It's a medical use patent. It's not a THCA patent.
It doesn't make a difference. The use is obvious. It's known. It won't hold up in an infringement court, a case of infringement against that patent, which is why you don't see them suing anybody.
I'm not a patent
they can't
lawyer,
enforce it.
I'm not a patent lawyer, but he's had it for quite a few years.
I've worked with a lot of patent lawyers in the last 25 years. I'm not a patent lawyer, but I have a lot of patents, and I know what it takes to get a patent. And you know, you can get a patent. That doesn't mean that it's going to hold up in an infringement case.
Very true.
That might be true.
Oh, it's definitely true. The best thing you should do is that if you come up with something that's cool, rather than patent it, just do what the folks at Coca-Cola did. Keep it a trade secret. Keep it a secret that only you know about, and then you'll be okay. That's the type of intellectual property you have in cannabis.
Trade secret.
Branding, I guess you could call a brand. If you trademark a brand or if you have a branded trademark, that's also a form of intellectual property. But getting patents, especially just around cannabis or the constituents of cannabis, I mean, you could come up with an end-use patent or come up with something that you think is new and not obvious, but chances are it's already been demonstrated. And if it's already been demonstrated, it's not novel, and if it's not novel, it can't be an invention.
Hey, so Rob, when did you start working on hashish?
Okay.
You were here.
You're here.
It's after I moved to Amsterdam. I mean, I moved from California and Indiana in grad school before I moved to Amsterdam. But yeah, when I got here, I moved into a hash culture. It's not that we didn't have hashish in California, but here there was a hashish culture.
It was dominant.
It was the dominant deal, yeah. But they didn't really have much marijuana to speak of, to be honest with you.
But for people listening, I mean, you mentioned what when you're in college, you wrote your paper. What was it called?
Botany and Ecology of Cannabis.
Okay, and then you followed that up with your 1981 release, Marijuana Botany.
Correct.
And then you started working on hashish.
Yeah, I moved to Amsterdam. What was it, 87?
Maybe.
1987, I guess it was. Yeah, almost 30 years ago now.
Well then, just in line of thinking of this, what's your next book project? Obviously, now that cannabis is finished, you must be working on something else.
Yeah, I'm working on another body of cannabis knowledge. Actually, it's not going to be coming out as a book, except possibly for sentimental value as a collection. But I'm working on trying to get this Turkish hemp knowledge together while I have the chance. And instead of publishing something from work I've done 10 or 20 years ago, I'm going to do it in reverse and publish the most recent done things first and then work back through the rest. But it's all about hemp, pretty much.
I got a question about hash. Are you in any way looking to update in the next, 2 or 3 years hashish with some of the breakthroughs that have occurred in the world of dry sifting, in the world of rosin, these sort of things that are fairly new that haven't really been written about?
Well, that's an interesting that you'd mention it, because at the moment the book is sliding out of print, I would say, because it's near future. And maybe there was a bit of a revision a few years ago, but yeah, it's maybe done its time. Maybe the new knowledge should be somewhere else. Maybe it should be written by people who do what they're doing. Not me secondhand. I mean, just personally, that's the way I see it. I have stuff to do. I mean, it's not just that, but yeah, I think people should write what they're doing. I think they are. I think they extend information through YouTube and Instagram, and especially YouTube. And gee whiz, how many videos are there of how to do cool stuff and make cash? Come on. Those are the people who are the experts these days. The people
Yeah,
who are in the trenches.
you still want to put it in print. You still want to have it in that. And like the book hashish to me is the greatest concentration. It's the 90 micron, that whole book, right? It's just like, yeah, we'll just do all the best shit and we'll just put it all in here and it'll always. It's like we need to have the Bible constantly updated. Is all I'm saying.
I agree with you. I like books.
Yeah, books will always have their place, just like vinyl records. You know, like people will always want vinyl. They're never gonna, you know, there's always gonna be people that love them, and books that they play an important role in the sense that one day, if some of this digital knowledge is lost or blipped and gone, that books can still be there.
I like the
There you go.
feel.
There you go.
Feel.
Yeah, I like books too. I'm just frustrated by changes in how people favor to receive information these days, shall I say. And I don't want to just be cranky about it and continue publishing books just because they're cool. Now, if I can afford to publish books just because they're cool, I will do that. But at the moment, I'd sort of like to get, since I'm not making any money anyway, I'd sort of like to get a little bang for my not buck and educate a bunch more people. If you get my drift, I mean, give it away. I didn't make any money on that book anyway. I don't foresee making a heap, no matter if it comes out in paperback. No matter if they make the Kindle a lot cheaper, whatever. It's not
Here
gonna.
we go.
You know.
How about the hashish app?
Okay. Now you're talking.
You know, I really respect you saying that, Rob. I mean, as someone that tries to create projects like the Culture High or the Union or my first book or any of the things I've worked on, like the Emperor, it's about transmitting information and sharing this knowledge, and you don't get paid on any of that stuff. It's all a labor of love, and you know, you put 17 years into a book like Cannabis, there's obviously the only return you can get is the good feeling you get from sharing it with us all, which is why I'm so enthusiastic about it, and I thank you so much for doing it. 'Cause I don't think there's a reward so great that could, you know, really reward you for the contribution you've played in helping us understand what you've learned and communicating that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Todd. Those are gracious words.
We also spent 15 years with publishing the IHA, the JIHA.
Journal of the International Hemp Association.
The first science-based cannabis journal in years.
That was a good effort.
I really actually wanted to ask questions about it, but you know, I was sticking with hashish. You know, when I first saw the journal in the 90s, I was blown away. And these educational kits that you put together were fantastic. I was fortunate enough to buy one back in the mid-90s that had crayons and oil and fabric and all of these wonderful elements of teaching. And you know, this is something I would love you guys to talk about, because you really took cannabis education into a peer-reviewed level and actually created a little textile kit that you could touch, feel, smell, and learn what cannabis was. And no one in the world has done that but you guys, and I want to say thanks for that. But how the hell did you get to that in between your hash and your cannabis growing? Crayons.
Well,
hemp crayons.
We did have a little free time. But no, it was kind of ideas that Sam and I could cook up together. You know, he was one of the pioneers in doing this, really, and we just needed a group that was really devoted to getting real information out to people, whatever it was. They called it the International Hemp Association, but it was really the International Cannabis Association.
And Dave Pate also helped us.
Dave Pate was instrumental in this, and Hio Vanderwerf worked with us.
Hio.
And yeah, we had a good team going. But and we solicited articles from all over the world. It was really pretty cool. And there was a lot going on in the early 90s that, in a lot of ways, more variety of things going on than today. There are probably more people involved than ever. The European Industrial Hemp Association just met a few months ago, and I think they had close to 200 delegates this time. Now, a bit of this is a CBD buzz because it's become a hemp issue, but rightly so, I suppose. But some of that's a bit of a bump from that. But still, what I'm saying, that's a lot of delegates to go to an industrial hemp meeting. So, and we're a pretty international bunch. I saw people from all over the place. I didn't go, but I read the list. Yeah, when we got here, it was just becoming legal to grow hemp again in large parts of Europe, Western Europe especially. That effort, it was an effort we could help with. And we helped with the Vavilov Institute trying to preserve what genetics they had. I'm not sure in hindsight how successful we were and how unsuccessful they'd been before we started working with them, but we'll find out with the Phylos project again.
While we worked with them, we were fairly successful.
Yeah, we were successful in helping them out and keeping things alive. It's just maybe that the collections we preserved weren't as pure breeding as we might hope they would be. Some of Carl Hillig's work showed this a bit, and it's been interpreted other ways, but it's probably just contamination and trying to keep open pollinated lines separate. They had over 400 of them, which they produced in about 9 different facilities or something back in the Soviet days. But as all that fell apart, we took the money and helped them get freezers and do all that stuff they needed to do to keep what they had alive and grow some of it out. So it was all fun.
I know that the part of the collection just moved into the hands of Ben Dronkers and Hempflax, and I had the honor of visiting a test plot where they had 200 different varieties growing simultaneously, and there was the gentleman out there doing all the readings and such, and it was just great to see the diversity in the varieties of hemp that came from the Vavilov, and that's only, I believe, not even half of what he begot from them.
It's a registered European variety now.
Yeah, Finola developed from their sessions, just a hybrid between 2 of them. So, and then polished up from there. So that shows you what gene banks can be good for right there.
Yeah, I actually made the hybrid and gave it to Jace Calloway.
Right. Jace ran with it in Finland, hence Finola.
High oil content, was able to survive under.
Oh, I don't know if you can hear or not, but what's even more important is that it's the highest seed yielding. It'll give 2 tons per hectare, where most varieties can barely get a ton. Varieties like unisex.
It makes sense. I wonder if it's the oil content or it's just the amount of seeds that you're getting is just like double.
It's just a little short plant with a great phenotype for seed production.
Yeah, I saw him speak about it in Vancouver at the hemp symposium that they threw here one year in the 90s.
I was there. I spoke at it.
So then, for those of us that are still in the world where we're calling stuff sativa and indica, obviously cannabis evolution and ethnobotany, you kind of move away from that. How do you see us classifying the current cannabis that we smoke in a more appropriate manner?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the cannabis we don't smoke, and that would be cannabis sativa. You mentioned it earlier. This represents the European, or at least Western Eurasian, traditional varieties that were used for fiber and oilseed, and those became the early accessions taken to America. On and on. All the rest of the cannabis, and we call that cannabis sativa. It's what Carl von Linné, Carlos Linnaeus called cannabis sativa. It's not breaking with tradition to do it. It's following tradition. And then the rest of the world, apart from that cannabis, all the rest of the cannabis in the world, except for Western Europe, North America, and a little bit in South America and Chile, a couple other places, it's all indica. All of it. Whether it comes from Afghanistan, or India, or China, or Korea, or Thailand, some version of indica. Now this is based on basically what Carl Hillig figured out using isozymes of differences in proteins rather than differences in DNA, as people are more prone to do today. But this is only research that was published 10 years ago, okay? And Carl basically showed through the diversity of these compounds and terpenes and phenotypic characteristics as well, gross phenotypes, that there were these differences, and that the large encompassing group was cannabis indica, divided into, if you don't include the supposed wild or escape type, then 3 subspecies, basically. Indica subspecies indica, the narrow leaf drug varieties from India, okay, basically, the ones that Lamarck had described and originally called cannabis indica. And that's, once again, following tradition. This is the main subspecies. This is what we had before we had things from Afghanistan. This is the old-fashioned varieties. The Mexican, the Colombian, the Jamaican, like I talked about earlier. Thai, all that came from and all the African varieties too, yes. Came from southern African varieties. Came from India originally, from the Indian ganja variety, marijuana variety. The other one that we know about, just to get the other one out of the way.
Can I just pause you for a second? Are you guys like actively making hash over there?
Are we at the moment?
I'm wondering. Sounds like you got a roto tap going in the background. I just
No.
That was me bubbling.
No, that's trying to get the.
Your bong is so big that we can hear it in California.
We can hear you totally.
Completely.
We've actually made 43 kilos and 200 grams of hash.
There you go.
During hash church.
Yes, this is really.
He is making hash during hash church. I couldn't hear it the whole time. It was so repetitive and so long. There was only so many things it could be. I knew he wasn't subtly drumming to his beat in his own head. I knew that wasn't it. I knew it wasn't. It was motivated by, I'm going to get high later. Okay.
All right.
I'm just joking.
Now control yourself.
Makes me want to smoke some hash.
But anyway, back to that. The long story, but I'll make it as short as possible. There's the Chinese varieties, okay? They were also for hemp and seed, primarily. Not a drug culture, at least not in recent history. And that would include Korea and Japan. And those varieties are broad-leafed hemp varieties, as broad as I ended up calling them, wide-leaf hemp varieties, as Carl called them. And then there's, of course, Afghan. That's Cannabis indica, subspecies Afghanica, the broadleaf drug varieties. That's what came to us, starting in the late 70s and has been hybridized ad infinitum with the original narrow-leaf drug varieties we had, and that's what's given us what we have today. So that's how we see how I see, Mark and I see, and others, John McPartland and Carl Hillig and Ernest Small, although he just published a long paper and renamed them again, which I wasn't quite sure the need to. But anyway, we all are reading pretty much from the same page. Yeah, Sam's figures it's about right. But it'll be interesting to put the Phylos project to work and see the interrelatedness of the land races that were around and back in the day when they were first around, and ones that were found where they were originally from, and put them into this project and see how they are interrelated. This is the evolutionary side that fascinates me. I kind of know what happened in the historical side. I'm much more interested to figure out what I don't know that predates my historical side. So, yeah.
Because you're awesome.
Someone's asking about Japanese strains. Someone's saying, do you guys know anything about any Japanese strains?
5 or 6 Korean.
Yeah, there's been Korean ones. The Japanese have one registered variety.
And a couple of them land races.
Yeah, and a few other land races around, but one registered
They use them
variety.
to make kimonos.
Yeah, they're hemp things, too.
Yeah, they use them to make kimonos, ceremonial kimonos.
Yeah, ropes and all kinds of ceremonial uses, but it's a really rare, expensive fiber. But yes, they do grow it there. That mostly in a place called Tochigi, Ken, and that's and what they grow is Tochigi Shiro. It means white Tochigi. So yeah, that's the government variety. Very low THC.
Rob, I guess you saw the article where they went and actually met with the women who actually made the garments, and their teeth are worn from pulling the hemp with their teeth.
Yeah.
Separating the fibers.
They split the strips of bark into narrower strips of bark. Yeah. They ran out of fingernails.
Rob, where is the hemp finer? In Japan or in Korea or in China? The finest of the finest you've ever seen.
The finest hemp weaving I've seen, sheerest hemp, finest yarns, thinnest cloth would be Japanese or Japanese style cloth made in Korea, you could also say. But yeah, it's incredible. It's like.
Can I ask a paper question? Who's making the best paper in the world right now?
I really don't know. There used to be a mill that did cigarette papers and stuff still in Turkey, but it's closed. I think
it's in Spain now.
Spain's got Celosa, right? Not Celosia.
Yeah. And we use Schneiderson for the journal.
Yeah, and Schneiderson was the paper supplier in Germany. They're a big paper supplier. I'm sure if they made custom batches for us, right? Is that what they ended up doing?
No, they sold it on the market, but
we were probably the only ones who ever bought it.
We might have been one of them. Yeah. But we used it for all 12 of or 16, whatever it was.
Yeah, we printed our journals on it just to be patriotic.
100% yeah.
But
hey guys, I'd like to point out that I just tried to link to your International Hemp Association.org website, and the links to the journals don't work. I get a 404. So you might want to, if we could request that you all get that fixed.
I looked with it a few days ago and it worked.
Yeah, it's maintained as a labor of love. So, yes, a few days ago it worked, according to Sam. So it'll probably come back on again. It's a bit difficult to search articles on it. It isn't really indexed. You have to go to each issue and see what's in it. Sort of. It's not too smooth. But it's been up there for ages. It's done by one of our
Do you think there's
volunteers.
I was going to ask, is there an economic reason why hemp isn't being used more for paper and cardboard packaging?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of reasons. It doesn't make much sense to grow fibers unless they have for things like packaging, unless they have a very high-end use. I mean, hemp flax can grow hemp fiber and get it into Mercedes-Benz car door panels and stuff, but they wouldn't be able to sell it for enough if a paper processor bought it. There's also probably a limited number of paper mills that can work with it anymore too, but that's another consideration. But even if there were, it doesn't travel economically. It needs to be done on a local basis. Paper making is polluting.
Well, yeah, I mean that's just a point. I mean, the fact is that
I just checked the links. They work absolutely fine.
You're using mostly waste from the wood and lumber industry to essentially turn turn into
You need to be growing more
paper and
hemp.
pulp.
That's the real story, Mark. You need more hemp. That's why there isn't enough for anything, and exactly as Rob says, it needs to be grown locally and processed locally. I've made hemp paper.
Free sawdust, which basically they have to get rid of. They're now mandated in the lumber industry and everywhere else that they make chips to get rid of their waste responsibly. They can actually sell it to a paper mill if it's the right quality for them, some of it at least. And so that's kind of a win-win situation for everybody. They don't have to get much for it, but they got to get rid of it. So that's what you're competing against with any natural fiber. It's not just about hemp, you know. Flax would have the same problem and it yields even less. So yeah.
It's why we had such problems with dealing with hemp in Eastern Europe. We were so landlocked to ship or move it to actual factories to process it or strip it down into, you know, fiber, spin it into a fiber, then ship it into the manufacturer that puts it into a cloth, et cetera, et cetera. So the herd and everything is lost along the way, and it's really kind of a waste because it's just not enough of it. It's mostly grown for the fiber itself, Mark. You know, or it was back when we were dealing with it in Eastern Europe.
I guess the way myself as an industrial chemist, the way I look at it is that it's cellulose. It's all cellulose, and so the cheapest form of cellulose at the end of the day is going to win. And so whether that cheapest form of cellulose comes from off of the floor at the sawmill because the sawdust just happens to be there when you're making 2x4s and lumber, okay, I get that. But the other thing that we have to take in consideration is that there's a whole lot more chemicals that are used to delignify wood than to delignify hemp. Hemp's got a whole lot less lignin in there, which is basically what you're doing in a paper mill. You're just separating the lignin from the cellulose because the cellulose is what the paper is. So at the end of the day, you know, I don't know if 10 years or 20 years down the road, at some point, hemp is going to be a more economical form of cellulose and will replace wood. It's just an economic reality.
Well, we're hoping for so. We're just starting to see test trials here in America in certain states now due to, you know, the legality, and we're going to see, you know, we're going to see a whole new industries come out of it. We were talking 20 years ago, you know, all the 50,000 products that can be made, et cetera, but when the rubber hit the road, you know, Ben could only sell his herds for animal bedding. You know, that's what worked. That's what worked economically. That's what worked locally. You know, that's going to happen locally and regionally as these things come to scale. That's the reality. Is it's cheaper and accessible right now.
I think what's going to happen, and I don't know if Rob would agree with me on this, I think the main driver is going to be protein production in the hemp seed. Protein production in the hemp seed is going to be the economic driver that's basically going to bring hemp to a scale of farming that, again, is going to create a huge volume of cellulose that's going to be cheaper than sawdust.
Well, I can tell you that the protein and the seed is exactly what we grow hemp for in Canada for 20 years now. But it's not to make it cheap. It's expensive. That seed sells for like almost $15 or something for like a little like 400 ml bottle or something. Like it's become about the most expensive product that you can get. This protein and the protein powder isolate, that's the byproduct of pressing the seed cake to get your oil.
Imagine if instead of Roundup Ready soybeans all throughout Manitoba and Western Canada, imagine if instead of soybeans those were hemp plants, right? And those were hemp plants creating hemp seed for hemp seed protein. It will happen someday because again, it's just I
think we grew 33,000 hectares last year in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario.
Which is not a pimple on the ass of what's grown in terms of soybean and corn, right?
Oh God, no! Or any like flax or any of the other stuff.
Any of the typical row vegetables or row industrial crops.
Yeah, we have millions of acres of farmable land, millions of acres. So it's Just a very small percentage of that, that's for sure. And it's because we've never turned it into paper, we never turned it into products. I've always considered the fact that the infrastructures are truly immense. They are billion-dollar infrastructures. People think it's just plug and play, and they're like, oh, let's just use hemp for this instead of this, and we'll just like, you don't even have to change anything, and in fact, you do have to change everything, and you do change a lot of things for certain things.
Yeah, I agree with Mark that should there be enough seed grown, and growing seed is the most viable thing to do with hemp. It always has been since the hemp movement changed, the way people were thinking about hemp. It's the fiber thing has fallen away pretty much, and where's the paper? But the seed thing's carried on. That if that really does take off, then of course you'd have a byproduct from that. You'd have the chaff or whatever. They need to chop it up and get rid of it like any other industry. They can put it back on the fields. The lumber companies can't really put it back in the forest, but
Right.
there are other alternatives. But there could be a surplus of stuff. One thing I'd like to mention is that when the hemp thing was going 20 years ago, and 15, 20 years ago, when it was at its heyday, let's say, it was really fascinating. There was a lot of energy to it. And looking back, probably a lot of it was premature. I think now is a much more opportune time for somebody to try to get involved in the hemp business. I mean, cannabis has, you don't have to go around telling people that hemp is related to cannabis and, oh yeah, cannabis and all that. I mean, the times have completely changed. Now everybody knows what cannabis is, and everybody knows that hemp comes from. So, not everybody, but a lot more people. So it might be interesting to see, if somebody launches something these days with a little bit better supplies of raw materials, possibly even if the Chinese mills are still rocking, and Ben's trying to get online in Romania. It'll be interesting to see how the second wave of the hemp industry pans out.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how that transpires, because after being part of the initial one that kind of fizzled, there was a great deal of enthusiasm, and there still is, and it's great to see. I saw the HIA just had its gathering of people and such, and there just needs to be innovation and more pushing. But again, they're still stymied by this this fictitious EU seed that I think is limiting somewhat to the industrial ideas that we've been presented about cannabis. But I still think that Ben and others have proven through firsthand realities. Even though Ben himself took 17 years loss to make a profit out of hemp flax. So that's a great deal of time, money, research. Not many people have that. So again, respect for even having that opportunity to do that. But he's led the way for many of us to see that yes, it can be done, because my car outside has his hemp in it right now, and that's a beautiful thing, but yet a frustrating thing, because I still have to tell people about it. They still don't know about it. They still don't understand its possibilities.
No, that's really right. No, it's a long way to go. It'll be fun to see how things change. And I think the food products, the whole seed thing, is really always has been the biggest interest to me. I like the fiber. I like all the interesting costumes women make and all that. But when you hear them talk about the seeds and what they're good for and how they've eaten them for years, and then you realize that that's possibly even more important, especially in places that have marginal supplies of good food.
Oh, especially in areas of the world where people don't have enough to eat, or people are dying, or they're not getting a nutritious enough diet. That this can mean a matter of life and death for a village.
Fill your tummy and uplift your spirit.
Yeah, for most of those places, though, that are starving, if you think about it for a minute, they're not places where you can grow hemp. So it's not like we're going to have people employed growing their own food. It's going to have to be an aid thing. You have to ship it like rice, and it's going to have to be grown where it's temperate, climates, when that's northern North America and Eurasia. So.
Well, right now they're too busy plowing down the rainforest to make room for more cattle ranches, so we could have more Big Macs and T-bone steaks in the world. I mean,
and to grow more soybeans to feed those animals too. That's what all that's cut down to.
Bingo. Yeah. So watch all the hemp
Right.
seed that should be going to human consumption.
There you go.
Could be going to bovine and T-bone steaks, right?
I'm going to sign off here.
I'm a meat eater.
Thank you all for all the good questions, especially and good to see all you guys again. Rachel, we got to meet sometime.
Awesome, Rob.
Thanks for holding it down for
Thank
the
All you
academic.
guys.
Thank you,
ATM.
Rob, as always. Much love, much respect.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good one, guys. Enjoy the evening in Amsterdam.
Bye,
All right.
Sam.